With both the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios still frantically anticipating their release of Fantastic Four on July 25th, we know that in the midst of the ongoing test screenings and the reshoots and everything else in between, such as Pedro Pascal getting overly political when it comes to his view on politics, where he should really stay in his lane as an actor and act responsible, this is really beginning to take a turn for the worst. This is Mike Zero. Subscribe if you're new and like this video to see future updates. You can also follow me at Mike01. I thank you also very much for the great and kind support. Now, there's a reason why I, and along with many other people out there, call Pedro Pascal Pedro Zegler, is that he is acting very much like Rachel Zegler when it comes to spewing out his politics where it should not belong when promoting a movie like Fantastic Four, a movie associated with Marvel Studios, mind you, and a movie that should really just focus on the story. We already know that Disney and even Pedro admitted that there's going to be gender politics intertwined into the story of Fantastic Four, and there's been a lot of dialing back on that by Bob Iger, by, of course, those over at Marvel Studios in the midst of the reshoots and the re-edits of this movie, trying to really water that down to make it less obvious once the movie does debut next month. But what's interesting here has a lot more to do with exactly what Disney recently did against Pedro Pascal, and how it's a very ironic thing, and how it really kind of takes you back to what happened with Rachel Zegler months and months ago. Let's get into this. Now, specifically, we already know one thing about the Fantastic Four is that there are some things working against this movie, such as the trailer is really not generating as much excitement as it should for a movie like Fantastic Four. You know, I'm not saying this is any kind of Snow White situation, that's not the case. But for a Fantastic Four movie, especially for one being made by Marvel Studios, it needs to be overly excited by fans. It needs to be something that's going to be a movie that will knock it out of the park, right? Now, one thing about Pedro Pascal is that with both the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios still dealing with criticism and backlash against the Fantastic Four, and especially after Pedro got very political in recent days, one major development going on now involves how the Disney Company recently took action against Pedro Pascal and punished him in a very unexpected turn of events. Now, as Marvel frantically tries to steer Pedro and his politics away from the film, it turns out that Disney CEO Bob Iger, Disney executives, producers, and the board all came to a universal agreement to slash down the number of interviews and TV show appearances that Pedro Pascal would actually have to promote the Fantastic Four. Disney executives are already forcing Pedro to cut it out with his politics, since it's creating a negative impact on both the marketing campaign and the press tour for the film. Now, to make matters worse, during these arguments, Pedro refused to dial down on his politics and pressured the Disney Company that it's a free country and that he can say what he wants. This recent intense argument that took place is exactly what led the Disney Company to engage in an emergency meeting to cancel multiple events for Pedro Pascal to drastically reduce his presence on television and on the internet. Now, in a very similar way, ironically to what happened with Rachel Zegler, and to no surprise, Pedro is a major supporter of Rachel Zegler and her politics. Now, the heated arguments between both Pedro and the Disney executives even involved Rachel Zegler, where he informed Disney that he believes that they treated her very poorly by doing what they did to her. This alludes to her losing multiple Disney roles after Snow White. Now, guys, let me just say one thing about this. Now, the fact that Disney is now just beginning to take action against Pedro, I think, is another shred of proof that they are fully aware that they need this movie to do well. They need this movie to be a massive success in order to create momentum for Marvel in 2026. You know, such as with movies like Doomsday and others out there. And look, we know that the Ironheart series coming out on June 24th is also going to be something that could very well contribute to derailing the Fantastic Four success. You know, whether or not it will do that on an extreme level, who knows, but most certainly it will create some level of percentage of fans to walk away from the franchise. Now, what's interesting about this, yet again, is that with Pedro now, of course, with some level of, dealing with some level of consequences, essentially, from the Disney Company in the midst of him spewing his politics on social media and in recent appearances to promote the Fantastic Four, the only reason why Disney is just now taking action against Pedro is that through Disney analysts, producers, and executives learned that Pedro serves as a serious anchor to the success of this movie. There is already a grudge growing between both Pedro and Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, since he, of course, was the one to initiate this type of punishment toward the actor. Now, the type of interviews and the type of TV appearances that Pedro was actually cut out from were best described to be scenarios where he would actually promote the character of Reed Richards, promote the whole gender politics aspects of the Fantastic Four, and that's already beginning to backfire. Even Kevin Feige, get this, caved and decided to side with Bob Iger to make their agenda less obvious for the film. This is also all happening in the midst of reshoots and test screenings that are still active and underway for the Fantastic Four, just a little over 1 month before its release date on July 25th. Now let that sink in for a moment. The fact that they are still working on this movie, still trying to get it all done and over with, just a little over 1 month away. When you look at Superman is all done. It's all finished. James Gunn confirmed this. And that's also another thing that Fantastic Four has to worry about, is the overall buzz surrounding Superman. And whether or not that movie is going to be a success, that's also up in the air right now. But one thing is for certain is that I really have a very distinct feeling here that Superman could potentially be a bigger success than the Fantastic Four. Because look, like I said earlier, with Pedro confirming that they are shifting away from source material for this movie, the fact that they are really focusing on gender politics in this film, it's just not working. The things that Pedro is saying, it really did kind of serve as an anchor already to the success. Now, to close here, regardless of these consequences, Pedro made it very clear to Disney executives that he holds no plans of dialing down his politics, and his view on gender politics being a part of the main story for Fantastic Four. Pedro, of course, and his contract with Disney is best described to be very expensive and complex, and new details about that contract will be discussed in the coming days, so keep an eye on that. Actor Joseph Quinn, not surprising, who plays Johnny Storm, is also siding with Pedro's view on politics and his stance against Disney. Now look, the fact that Joseph Quinn is siding with Pedro, it shouldn't be all that surprising. This is the same exact actor, the same exact guy that said, yeah, we should maybe take a step back from Johnny Storm being the typical womanizer that he was in the previous movies in 2005 and 7 and in the comics. This time around, he's not going to be the type of womanizer, the type of arrogant type of Johnny Storm that you're used to. They're cutting it down, they're watering him down. And that's also another thing that people are against. Now look, we know that the Fantastic Four has one shot to becoming the Fantastic Four movie. Because if this one doesn't work, I don't see any other, chance for a Fantastic Four solo film to really thrive and be made. This is their one shot to make it right. After all the failures in the past, where it really did not meet a comic-accurate version, at the very minimum, the 2005 and 7 versions, they at least got the core elements of the story down correctly, and they got Johnny Storm and his overall behavior down correctly, stuff like that. It's just those movies never really were major success points at the box office, and even from critics in certain areas. But I would love to hear what everyone has to say about the whole Disney situation taking action against Pedro Pascal, ironically, in a very similar way to Rachel Zegler. And if you guys did enjoy the content for today, make sure to drop a thumbs up on this video to support the channel, and I will catch you guys later.